What if I told you some of the strangest weapons ever built weren't in sci-fi movies but in World War II? From rocket-powered death wheels to flaming bats and ghost foxes, both the Allies and Axis created machines so bizarre, you'd think they came from a comic book. These weren't just wild ideas, they were real, tested, and in some cases, nearly deployed. These are 5 secret World War II weapons you were never meant to know about. In the early 1940s, as World War II raged across the globe, the U.S. military began seeking unorthodox weapons that could give them a unique edge in defeating Japan. One of the strangest, and perhaps most absurd, ideas ever greenlit by the military was something straight out of a horror movie. It was called the Bat Bomb. The project's official name was Project X-Ray, and it was proposed by none other than a Pennsylvania dental surgeon named Lytle S. Adams, a friend of First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt. After a trip to Carlsbad Caverns in New Mexico, where Adams had witnessed thousands of bats emerge at dusk in a terrifying flurry of wings, an idea sparked in his mind. What if bats could be weaponized? He envisioned them as miniature kamikaze firebombers, living delivery systems that could carry tiny incendiaries into the wooden cities of Japan. At the time, Japanese architecture was still heavily dependent on wooden buildings, often packed close together. A small flame in the right place could grow into a full-scale disaster. Adams believed that if enough bats could be dropped from planes, each carrying a small timed incendiary device, they would naturally seek shelter inside attics, roofs, or overhangs, and when the timers ignited, entire neighborhoods would burn. The proposal was bizarre, but so was much of the wartime experimentation going on. Somehow, against all odds, the U.S. military said yes. By 1942, the project had received funding and a team was assembled under the leadership of Dr. Louis Fieser, a Harvard chemist who would later become notorious as the inventor of napalm. The development of the bat bomb required serious ingenuity. First, the team had to determine the best species of bat. They settled on the Mexican free-tailed bat, a tiny but strong flyer that could carry a payload of up to 15 to 18 grams, just enough for a small incendiary. The bats would be stored in bomb-like canisters designed to be dropped from altitudes of 5,000 feet. These containers had compartments that kept the bats in a state of hibernation, cooled with dry ice. When released, the container would open mid-air, the bats would wake up as they descended, and naturally flutter off into nearby buildings. At least, that was the plan. The incendiaries themselves were incredibly advanced for the time. Small but deadly, they used a nitrocellulose time delay fuse and could reach temperatures of up to 1,000 degrees Celsius. Once ignited, they would set almost any flammable material ablaze in seconds. Tests began in earnest at the Carlsbad Army Airfield Auxiliary Air Base, not far from the bat colonies that had inspired Adams' wild idea. However, from the very beginning, the project was plagued by disaster. In one infamous test in 1943, a group of bats accidentally escaped during a demonstration. Before anyone could react, several bats flew under a fuel truck and into a hangar. Within minutes, the base was ablaze. The damage was extensive, and it was caused by the very weapon they were trying to develop. Despite the chaos, the military didn't immediately shut down the project. Testing continued, and several iterations of the canisters and incendiary devices were improved. Even the Marines got involved. By now, the military brass had given the project to the U.S. Navy, who renamed it Project X-Ray. There were high hopes it could turn into a game-changer. However, time was running out. While Adams and his team refined their living weapons, another, far more powerful weapon was being secretly developed in the New Mexico desert: the atomic bomb. Compared to that, a flying army of flaming bats seemed comical. In 1944, Fleet Admiral Ernest J. King reviewed the program's progress. Though the tests showed that the bats could cause damage, the logistical problems, delays, and unpredictable nature of using live animals made it too risky. He famously commented that the bat bomb wouldn't be ready for use until mid-1945, which he deemed too late. The next weapon may win the war, he said, referring, of course, to the Manhattan Project. With that, Project X-Ray was quietly cancelled. In retrospect, the bat bomb was a symbol of both wartime desperation and wild innovation. It combined biology, chemistry, and military strategy in a way never seen before. Though it never saw actual combat, it remains one of the strangest military projects in history. The idea of releasing thousands of bats as tiny arsonists across enemy cities is almost too bizarre to believe, yet it was real. The military buried the records for years, and only in later decades did the full scope of the project come to light. Lytle Adams returned to civilian life, disappointed but undeterred. He would later attempt to develop other inventions, though none would ever be as infamous as his airborne incendiary mammals. What's left of Project X-Ray now lives in obscure corners of military archives and history museums, where model bat bombs are occasionally displayed alongside descriptions that usually begin with, "Yes, this really happened." For many, it's a grim reminder of how far nations will go in times of war, and how surreal military invention can become when science, fear, and ambition collide. In the early 1940s, the British military faced an extraordinary challenge. If the Allies hoped to storm the beaches of Nazi-occupied Europe, they would need a way to breach the fortified Atlantic Wall, a vast coastal defense system bristling with bunkers, artillery, and concrete obstacles. Conventional tanks and explosives might not survive the heavily defended beaches. So, British engineers at the Department of Miscellaneous Weapons Development, an actual wartime division tasked with developing unconventional tools, were given free rein to brainstorm. What they came up with was something straight out of a madman's sketchbook, a massive, rocket-powered wheel armed with hundreds of pounds of explosives, designed to charge up the beach and explode against enemy fortifications. They called it the Great Panjandrum. The concept was as wild as its name. Imagine two enormous wooden wheels, each over 10 feet in diameter, joined by a central drum packed with high explosives. Attached to the rims of the wheels were dozens of cordite rockets, angled to drive the contraption forward. When ignited, these rockets would propel the Panjandrum across the beach at high speed, ideally smashing into German bunkers and detonating with catastrophic force. The theory made sense on paper. The device would be launched from a landing craft and would supposedly barrel forward at nearly 60 miles per hour, immune to enemy fire due to its sheer speed. No human would steer it. It was intended to be a purely mechanical suicide weapon. Testing began along the quiet coastline of Westward Ho, a seaside village in Devon, England. The location was chosen for its resemblance to the beaches of Normandy. Military officials, engineers, and curious onlookers gathered to witness the first trials. And from the very beginning, things went hilariously wrong. The initial tests saw the Panjandrum stutter a few feet forward before collapsing in a sputtering, chaotic mess. Rockets flew off their mounts and spun unpredictably. The wheels wobbled and lost traction in the sand. Engineers adjusted the rocket alignment, doubled their number, and tried again. Each test seemed to invite a new form of catastrophe. In one memorable trial, the Panjandrum burst into uncontrollable motion, veered wildly off course, and headed straight for the viewing area where military officials stood in horror. The crowd scattered as the massive rolling death trap sped toward them, smoke trailing and rockets sparking. It crashed into the beach and exploded harmlessly, but the point was made. This thing was a menace to everyone. Still, British engineers pressed on, driven by desperation and Churchill's call for innovation. They even tried adding a third stabilizing wheel and experimented with remote steering via steel cables. The modifications barely helped. The Panjandrum continued to perform with all the grace of a drunk bull in a china shop. It spun, toppled, exploded prematurely, or veered completely off course. Rumors spread that the tests were so unpredictable that even the local dogs were terrified of the beach. Villagers reportedly watched the spectacle from a distance, not knowing whether they were witnessing genius or insanity. By late 1944, it became clear that the Great Panjandrum was not only ineffective, it was dangerous to Allied forces. The unpredictability of the rocket propulsion, combined with its massive explosive payload, meant that any battlefield deployment could easily result in friendly fire, or friendly obliteration. The project was quietly abandoned, and no Panjandrum ever made it to the shores of Normandy. Allied commanders eventually favored more practical methods for breaching the Atlantic Wall, such as explosive-filled tanks like the Churchill AVRE and aerial bombing runs. Today, the Panjandrum is remembered less as a weapon and more as a symbol of wartime absurdity. Its legacy lives on in military history museums, engineering textbooks, and YouTube reenactments. The very idea of a giant rocket-powered wheel loaded with explosives charging up a beach sounds like something from a steampunk fever dream, but it was very real. Even the name, Panjandrum, had roots in British satire. It was borrowed from a piece of 18th-century nonsense writing by Samuel Foote, meant to mock pompous bureaucratic jargon. Naming the contraption after a satirical phrase may have been an inside joke, or perhaps a grim prophecy of the project's inevitable failure. What's most astonishing is not that the Panjandrum didn't work, but that it was ever considered seriously. In the crucible of war, logic often bends under the pressure of urgency, and even the most unhinged ideas can find funding and support. To modern eyes, the Panjandrum looks more like a Monty Python sketch than a viable weapon. But in the context of a desperate fight against Nazi Germany, almost nothing was off the table. In the end, the great Panjandrum never killed a single Nazi bunker. But it did manage to frighten generals, injure a few engineers, and earn a permanent place in the Museum of Military Madness. Its clattering, flaming test runs on Devon's beaches have become part of legend, a warning about what happens when invention runs faster than reason. By the midpoint of World War II, the German military had already pioneered many terrifying technologies: the V-2 rocket, jet-powered aircraft, and even early cruise missiles. But behind the curtain of Hitler's high command was an entire world of secret weapons, projects that seemed to leap from the pages of pulp science fiction. Among the strangest of these was the Windkanone, or wind cannon, an experimental weapon intended to use compressed air to destroy enemy aircraft with nothing but the power of sound and pressure. The idea was deceptively simple. Build a massive cannon capable of firing invisible shockwaves that would knock Allied planes out of the sky. Unlike conventional anti-aircraft weapons that relied on bullets or explosives, the Windkanone would use air pressure alone, a clean weapon in a dirty war. But as with many Nazi superweapons, the idea quickly spiraled into the bizarre. Developed near the city of Dresden under the guidance of engineer Dr. Zippermeyer, the Windkanone looked like a twisted industrial art piece. Mounted along the wall of a viaduct, the cannon featured a 40-foot-long barrel, attached to a massive combustion chamber. This chamber was where a mixture of hydrogen and oxygen would be ignited. The explosive force would rapidly compress air behind a cone-shaped projectile, or sometimes, just the air itself, which would then shoot out of the barrel at high velocity. The result was a targeted slug of air meant to deliver a concussive blow. In theory, the shockwave would travel upward into the sky and either hit low-flying enemy bombers or damage them structurally with sheer air pressure. Early reports claimed that the shockwave could shatter wooden boards at short distances, giving the illusion that it might be powerful enough to disrupt a plane's flight path or damage its control surfaces. Nazi scientists were so enthusiastic that they built several prototypes, one of which was positioned to defend a critical power plant in southern Germany. But theory is one thing, practical application is another entirely. The reality was less than impressive. The range of the Windkanone was extremely limited. Its power dropped off dramatically beyond just a few dozen meters. While it could splinter wooden planks placed a few feet in front of the barrel, it stood no chance against reinforced aircraft flying hundreds or even thousands of feet in the air. It was like trying to shoot down a bomber with a violent sneeze. Moreover, the cannon required enormous amounts of hydrogen and oxygen for each firing. These gases were not only difficult to produce in wartime Germany, where resources were already stretched thin, but also highly flammable and dangerous to handle. Operating the Windkanone was a logistical nightmare and a safety hazard. Engineers had to stand clear during tests, and rumors swirled of spontaneous explosions that destroyed more of the testing ground than any imagined enemy target. There were also major issues with aiming. The cannon could not swivel or track moving aircraft. It was mounted in place, meaning that even if a bomber happened to fly into its line of fire, the operator had only one chance to release the shockwave at precisely the right moment. Given the speed and altitude of Allied bombers, this was nearly impossible. Nevertheless, Nazi propaganda hyped up the Windkanone as a miraculous new invention that would soon sweep Allied planes from the skies. The SS and Luftwaffe both showed interest in the project, and funding continued into late 1944. But as with many of the so-called Wunderwaffe, wonder weapons, the results never matched the ambition. In desperation, some engineers proposed using the Windkanone as a ground weapon, perhaps to knock out advancing infantry or damage buildings. But these ideas were equally far-fetched. By that point in the war, Germany was under relentless bombardment from Allied air raids. Resources were dwindling, cities were crumbling, and there was simply no time to continue pouring funds into an impractical, oversized air gun. Eventually, the Windkanone was abandoned. Allied forces overran the sites where they were built, finding rusting barrels and scorched test ranges. Some of the documents survived, allowing historians to piece together the extent of the project. It had never claimed a single aircraft and had never been deployed in combat. It was, by all measures, a failure, but one born from a strange blend of scientific curiosity and wartime desperation. The Windkanone now stands as a symbol of the absurd lengths to which the Nazi regime went in search of miracle weapons. Rather than focusing on proven methods and realistic technologies, Hitler and his top brass were often drawn to the mystical, the theatrical, and the impossibly advanced. Projects like the Windkanone appealed to their vision of a futuristic, unstoppable Germany, one where enemies could be defeated not with bullets, but with invisible waves of power. Interestingly, the concept of using sound or air pressure as a weapon didn't die with the Nazis. In the decades after the war, various governments, including the United States and Soviet Union, continued researching so-called sonic weapons and non-lethal force using sound or pressure waves. Modern crowd control devices like the LRAD, long-range acoustic device, are distant cousins of the Windkanone. However, none rely on sheer air shockwaves to destroy vehicles or structures. The science just doesn't support it. Today, the remains of the Windkanone are little more than crumbling ruins and dusty blueprints tucked away in archives. Some of the parts were salvaged for scrap, others buried under post-war reconstruction. A few photographs still exist, showing the enormous barrel pointed skyward, a silent monument to failure. The Windkanone never made history as a weapon of war, but it did make history as a warning. When science is twisted by ideology and desperation, the results can be both spectacular and useless. For all its ambition and spectacle, the Windkanone proved that even the loudest ideas can land with nothing more than a whisper. In a time of global conflict, when the world was racing to develop new machines of destruction and mobility, the British took a bold leap of imagination, quite literally. Deep in the heart of wartime experimentation, a group of British engineers and inventors began working on a project that, at first glance, sounds like a child's fantasy, a jeep that could fly. This was not some artist's sketch or early concept drawing. It was a real, physical prototype built and tested during World War II. It was called the Hafner Rotabuggy, though many later referred to it more humorously as the flying jeep. To understand how such an oddity came into being, it helps to look at the challenges facing airborne troops during the early 1940s. Paratroopers were able to descend behind enemy lines, but they were often left without vehicles or heavy equipment. Transport planes couldn't land in hostile territory, and gliders were expensive and unwieldy. What if, military minds wondered, you could drop a lightweight, multi-purpose vehicle into battle zones without requiring a landing strip? Enter Raoul Hafner, an Austrian-born helicopter pioneer working in Britain. Known for his passion for rotorcraft, Hafner proposed a wild solution. Take a standard Willis Jeep, the dependable 4x4 utility vehicle used throughout the Allied forces, and attach a rotor system to its roof. This rotor would act like a gyrocopter blade, allowing the Jeep to glide after being released from a tow aircraft. Once near the ground, it could land like a normal vehicle, be detached from its flying gear, and driven off into battle. The British Ministry of Supply, ever hungry for creative battlefield solutions, approved initial funding. Thus began the creation of the Rotabuggy, a bizarre fusion of automobile and rotorcraft that looked like something from a cartoon. The design included a 40-foot diameter rotor blade, a tailplane with rudder and elevators, and a glider-style undercarriage. Despite its Frankenstein appearance, The engineers approached the task with meticulous care. Early prototypes were tested with ballast instead of humans, and towed behind vehicles at high speeds to simulate flight conditions. At first, things went poorly. The weight distribution was awkward, the rotor didn't generate enough lift, and the Jeep's handling was severely compromised. However, Hafner and his team were determined. They refined the rotor assembly, improved the tail stability, and enhanced the suspension to absorb the shock of landing. By 1943, test flights began in earnest. The Rotabuggy was towed behind a Whitley bomber, released in the air, and allowed to glide downward like a gyrocopter. Astonishingly, it worked. The modified Jeep achieved controlled descents, and in several tests, landed safely on open fields. The pilot, who sat in the front of the Jeep, reported that the controls were responsive, if somewhat crude. The vehicle could glide at speeds of up to 45 miles per hour, and land within a reasonable margin of safety. But the problems remained. The Rotabuggy was underpowered and clunky in the air, requiring highly specific towing speeds and altitudes to perform correctly. The rotor system added enormous drag, making it inefficient compared to conventional gliders. Once on the ground, the pilot had to manually detach the rotor system, hardly ideal under enemy fire. And while the idea of a flying Jeep was charming, the practical benefits were limited. Traditional gliders, like the British airspeed Horsa, could carry full squads of soldiers and vehicles in one trip, with better safety records. The final blow to the project came with the improvement of aircraft capable of airdropping Jeeps using parachutes. The US and Britain began developing cargo systems that could lower vehicles directly from the belly of a plane, eliminating the need for bizarre hybrids like the Rotabuggy. As logistics improved, the idea of flying Jeeps became less a necessity and more an eccentric distraction. By late 1944, the Rotabuggy project was shelved. Hafner, undeterred, went on to work on more promising helicopter technologies, eventually contributing to Britain's post-war aviation boom. The prototype Rotabuggy was reportedly dismantled or lost to history, though sketches and grainy test footage still circulate among aviation historians and military enthusiasts. In retrospect, the Hafner Rotabuggy was a strange mix of brilliance and absurdity. It represented a kind of wartime thinking where nothing was too strange to try. The concept of a flying Jeep was visionary, but ultimately flawed. The technology wasn't ready, and the battlefield didn't need it as much as its inventors had hoped. Yet, despite its failure, the Rotabuggy left a legacy. It inspired future generations of engineers to think outside the box, sometimes way outside. In modern times, militaries around the world continue to explore hybrid aircraft vehicle technologies, from drone carriers to flying motorcycles. Some of these owe a spiritual debt to the Hafner Rotabuggy, a machine that tried, however awkwardly, to put wings on a Jeep and make it soar. Its story is preserved today as one of the oddest chapters in aviation history. Photos of the vehicle look almost comical, a standard military Jeep with enormous rotors looming above it, like a toy made by a child who glued airplane parts to a model car. But it was real, it flew, and for a brief moment, it represented the bizarre, brilliant ambition of an era where innovation had no limits. During the height of World War II, while battles raged across Europe and the Pacific, deep inside the U.S. Office of Strategic Services, the forerunner of the CIA, a bizarre psychological warfare plan was being drafted. This was not a plan involving tanks or bombs, but foxes. Glowing, talking foxes. The goal: to harness Japanese superstition and folklore as a weapon of fear and confusion. This strange mission was named Operation Fantasia, and it remains one of the most surreal, if little-known, operations ever conceived during wartime. To understand Operation Fantasia, you need to understand kitsune, fox spirits deeply embedded in Japanese mythology. In Shinto and Japanese folklore, kitsune are often depicted as mystical beings capable of shape-shifting, possessing humans, or serving as messengers for the deity Inari. They're clever, magical, and sometimes feared as omens of bad luck or demonic influence. In rural Japan, especially in the early 20th century, belief in fox spirits was still widespread. The OSS wanted to exploit that. The idea was proposed in 1943 by Edward S. Hunter, an American psychological warfare specialist and linguist with deep knowledge of Japanese culture. His suggestion: engineer a supernatural event so convincing, so deeply rooted in Japanese fear and superstition, that it would shatter the morale of both civilians and soldiers alike. Hunter proposed training foxes, yes, real foxes, dressed in glowing paint, with mechanical speakers or attached noisemakers, and releasing them near military outposts, villages, or strategic locations at night. The foxes, now strange and ethereal in appearance, would slink through towns and fields under the moonlight, their glowing forms meant to terrify and confuse. Ideally, this would cause mass panic, desertion, or even the collapse of local morale. It was, essentially, weaponized folklore. The planning was dead serious. The OSS commissioned research into fox behavior, looked into Japanese rural psychology, and even investigated glow-in-the-dark materials that could be safely applied to the animals without harming them. Phosphorescent paint was the front-runner. The team even experimented with fox sounds and playback devices, small, lightweight gramophones or recorded screams meant to simulate supernatural voices. Hunter also suggested that these spirit foxes be accompanied by leaflet drops, whisper campaigns, or staged sightings by captured Japanese POWs reinserted as double agents. The Psychological Warfare Division believed that if villagers began reporting fox spirits aligned with the Americans or appearing in connection with U.S. forces, entire regions might begin to fear divine retribution, or worse, believe their military leadership had lost the favor of the gods. The planning grew more detailed and strange. One suggestion was to release the foxes during a full moon, heightening their otherworldly presence. Another proposed using recorded Japanese phrases like, "Beware. The fox spirits serve America now," to be broadcast through speakers in the darkness. Still another idea floated the possibility of using fox-shaped puppets mounted on wires to fly across villages at night. By late 1944, the OSS had acquired several foxes from zoos and wildlife suppliers and began early experiments. The first major problem became obvious quickly: foxes don't cooperate. They're skittish, solitary, and easily frightened. Many refused to move when released, or bolted into hiding. Worse, the glow-in-the-dark paint was unreliable and unsafe. Even when painted, the foxes would groom themselves obsessively, licking off the phosphorescent material. The process was potentially toxic, and keeping the paint visible long enough for ghost missions proved nearly impossible. Another significant issue arose: sound devices were too heavy. Early attempts at mounting gramophone speakers onto the foxes resulted in broken equipment and panicked animals. Engineers tried miniaturizing the devices, but battery life was short, and the result was often faint, garbled sound, hardly the terrifying cries of supernatural spirits. Despite these problems, a few small-scale tests were conducted on U.S. soil. Foxes were painted and released in rural areas at night to see how civilians would react. Results were inconsistent. Some observers found the animals creepy or unsettling, but no one thought they were ghosts. Worse, when people got close enough, the illusion was shattered. "It's just a fox with junk on it," one test witness reportedly said. The OSS began losing faith in the project. Hunter pushed for refinements, but other, more conventional psychological warfare programs, like leaflets, radio propaganda, and rumor spreading, were gaining traction with far better results. In late 1944, Operation Fantasia was quietly shelved, and the remaining foxes were returned to zoos or humanely released. The only legacy was a handful of classified documents, strange sketches, and internal memos that read more like a surreal screenplay than military strategy. Though the operation never saw combat deployment, it remains a haunting example of how deep wartime agencies were willing to dive into cultural manipulation. The idea of using fear, religion, and mythology as a weapon wasn't new, but Operation Fantasia represented an unprecedented attempt to turn spiritual folklore into a battlefield tactic. It combined animal behavior, ancient myth, and modern technology into one strange package, and it failed miserably. Today, Operation Fantasia has become a curious footnote in the archives of psychological warfare. Military historians often cite it as an example of creative thinking gone too far. The program has since inspired everything from fictional TV episodes to academic studies on the weaponization of culture and belief. There is a strange, almost poetic irony in the fact that, amid a war defined by bombs and bullets, one division tried to win minds with nothing more than ghosts, illusions, and the eerie glow of a fox in the night. Every case adds a new layer of mystery, leaving more questions than answers. Which one lingers in your mind, and what's your take on what really happened?